The Nevi'im Rishonim are written in a narrative historical style, and the later Nevi'im, which are Yirmiyahu, Yecheskel, Yeshayahu, and the 12 shorter prophets, they are all considered the later prophets, and they're written in a poetic style, in an allegorical style, not an historical style. So that's the big difference. So in the historical books, in the early prophets, the order is first Yehoshua, first the book of Joshua, which covers about the first 30 years or so that they were in the land of Israel. And then you have the book of Judges, which covers the whole time from Joshua's death until the beginning of Samuel. And Samuel is, of course, Shmuel is the one who anoints both kings, Shaul and David, the first two kings. So we're now in the book of Judges. The book of Judges covers a period from about 1200 BCE to about 950 BCE. It covers or 900 BCE. It covers a relatively long period of time. And the style is that after Joshua died, the tribes, they never conquered the seacoast yet. The tribes lived mostly in the highlands, and they became somewhat separated from each other. Each one was doing their thing and farming their land. And they had no king, and there was a Sanhedrin, but over time they began to learn from their neighbors and fell into idol worship. And when they fell into idol worship, God would allow their enemies to overcome them. And when things got desperate, they would turn back to God, and God would send them a prophet or a prophetess, because, as you know, prophecy is an equal opportunity employer. And the prophet would perform some great victory for them, or the judge would perform some great victory for them, and they'd be good for a while, and then they once again would backslide. And this cycle continued all the way until the times of Samuel. From the time of Samuel until the death of Rehoboam, the king after Shlomo, the Jews were pretty much not worshiping idols. But otherwise, this was a constant struggle. And just because we're going to read about it in this story of Devorah, you should understand it's very hard to be the only kid on the block. It's very, very hard to be the only one believing in one invisible God, when everyone else has gods that you can feel and see and touch, and has all kinds of fun and interesting ceremonies and festivals, and where you can do whatever you want. And the God of the Jewish people demands hard work, demands sobriety, demands morality, demands ethical behavior, and demands you worship one God, and even though you cannot see him. So it was very, very hard to be the only kid on the block. It's like when you were the only kid who had to go to Hebrew school. Everyone else got away with it. So it was tough. And what happened was that over time, the Jewish people would fall into the behavior patterns of their neighbors, until God showed them, by giving them into the hands of their neighbors and being persecuted by their neighbors, that they're going to be different no matter what. And even if they worshipped idols, the neighbors are still going to attack them and kill them and rob them and crush them and oppress them. So you might as well serve God. That's sort of the cycle of the time of the prophets. And this is actually discussed at the beginning of the book of Shoftim. Devorah is one of the earlier judges. She appears in the 4th chapter already. So let's take a look at the book itself. We're going to use the Machar Mamre because it's a nice, simple font and it's easy to read. So we're going to take the Machar Mamre and we're going to go to the beginning of the book of Judges, and then I'll get us to our Haftarah. Now, while I do that, would someone like to unmute and tell me, why do we read the Song of Devorah as the Haftarah for B'Shalach? Would anyone like to take a guess?
Because it's opposite Moses, Az Yashir Moshe.
Right. So it's the great song of thanks to God after a great salvation. Yeah. Now,
She was a judge.
right, and what's the connection, Mr. Voigt?
I remember that there was something about her being a judge.
Right, she's a judge. She's a leader. And
Good.
just as Moses led the Jewish people in song and Miriam led the Jewish people in song, so does he. Yeah. Here.
Yeah.
So here is in the second chapter of the book of Judges, yeah, there is a description of everything that happened. And Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died being 110 years old. And let me put it up so you guys can see it. Sorry, share. But I got a double chat here.
Rabbi, do the dates
Yeah.
match?
So yeah. So Natalie saw. Yeah. Obviously, it's easier to worship a God who looks like a person. Quite frankly, that is what Christianity sought to add. It sought to create, a God who could be personified as a human being and therefore easier to worship, among other things.
Rabbi, do the years fit?
In what sense?
Well, we supposedly date the Yetziat Mitzrayim to 1200 BCE.
Right. So
and Joshua lived how long after he left?
Right. So Joe, I discussed at the beginning of the class that our dating and the classically accepted dating can be off by as much as 200 years, but it's unclear that the classically accepted dating is anything more than a convention, because there's a lot we don't know about ancient dating. So at any rate, I don't worry about this, because as long as you can put together as long as you can lay one event opposite the other, the exact year that people think it happened is not so important, because there's a lot of uncertainty in ancient dating. So the answer is, the simple answer is that it works, but we're not always sure how it works. And we can have a separate class on dating another time, because it's a big topic.
It's there is a disagreement on the 12th century BC.
There's a lot of disagreements, both on the secular side and on the Judaic side. Basically, a lot of the stuff that we read about in Yeshua and Shoftim works better for the 14th century or 15th century BCE. That's why I say there's a 200. But if you take a look at the destruction layers, if you put aside the precise year, it works quite well. And again, ancient dating isn't like modern dating, and there's a lot of doubts in it. And again, the book Excavating the Bible discusses this at length, and you can get it for like $10 on Amazon. And if you have Kindle Unlimited, you can borrow it for free. So I encourage everyone to go look at the book Excavating the Bible, because this is literally a 2 to 3 hour discussion. I gave a class on it a while ago. Okay, so let's continue. So, but what we do know is the cycle of what happened. So they turned away from Hashem, and the children of Israel did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baalim. And they abandoned Lord, the God of their fathers. Took them out of Egypt. They followed other gods. It's not holy, you can say it. From the gods of the people around them, and they bowed to them, and they angered Hashem. The Yazuas Hashem, and they abandoned God. The Yavdu Baal, and they served the Baal Ashtaros into the Asherah. V'yicharf Hashem, and the anger of Hashem was kindled in Israel, and He gave them biyad shosim, in the hands of oppressors, v'yeshososim, and they oppressed them. Shosu, it says spoilers. Shosu actually means to crush, and they crushed them. And God sold them. He gave them over into the hands of their enemies, Misavim, from all around. And this is not a specific discussion. This is a general discussion, an introduction to the whole book of Judges, to that whole approximately 200-year period. They no longer could stand against their enemies. Wherever they went out to war, God's hand was against them to evil, and they failed as Hashem spoke, and as Hashem promised them. And then they were very, very distressed. Hashem shoftim, but then God raised up judges who saved them. Miyad shoseim, from those who crushed them and oppressed them. And the judges encouraged them to return, but once the trouble was over to the judges, they didn't listen. And once again, they went astray after other gods. We should bow to them. And they quickly walked aside from the way Hashem, from the path that their ancestors followed to hear the words of Hashem. So this is what happened. So God would raise them a judge, and Hashem would be with the judge and save them. And they would follow Hashem all the days of the judge, because Hashem would help them from their trouble. And then when it came to pass, when the judge would die, they went back and became even more corrupt than their ancestors. They became even more corrupt than their ancestors, and to worship them, and they left nothing undone from the bad practices of the people around them, and so on. So that is basically the story that happens time and time again. Okay, so that's the story. So now we need to go to Devorah. So this is the cycle that takes place over these 200 years, 250 years. And now we come to Devorah. And this was a part of the cycle. There had been a judge before. Ehud ben Gera. He was the second or the third of the judges, depending on how you count them. And before Haftarah begins, V'yosifu b'nei Yisrael asot hara b'nei Hashem. And the children of Israel continued to do evil in the eyes of Hashem. Ehud mate, and Ehud died. V'yimkreim Hashem, and Hashem sold them. V'yad Yavin melech Canaan, in the hands of Yavin, the king of Canaan. Asher malach b'Chatzor, who reigned in Chatzor. V'tzar tzava'o Sisra, v'yoshe b'charoshet hagayim. And his general was Sisra, and Sisra dwelt in Charoshet Hagoyim. Charoshet Hagoyim means literally the plowing place of the nations. And it's a reference to, no problem. I can paste it. You can't see the screen?
Yes,
Natalie, you can't see the screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyways, I posted it, whoever wants it. Okay.
Thank you. No, just because after the class, I like to study again.
Right, so you'd be better off using the Sepharia because they have all the commentaries there. So you might want to find the same text in Sepharia. Okay. So now here's an important thing. So Chatzor, we know Chatzor is in the north of Israel. And we know that Chatzor was a part of the Hittite Empire.
Sure.
And I'll talk more about this later, but there were two great empires in the times of the early settlement of the Jews in the land of Israel. Egypt and the Hittites. And Sisra, I found this actually in a non-Jewish source, Sisra, the Anchor Bible Dictionary makes the point that Sisra is a Hittite name. And also later he brings 900 iron chariots, which is like in modern terms saying someone brought 20,000 tanks to a battle. It's a huge army that only the greatest empire on the face of the earth could bring. So given that Chatzor was under the Hittites, and given that Sisra is a Hittite name, it follows that probably the people who came to fight with Devorah was not just the king of Chatzor, but was to support his vassal. The Hittite Empire sent its entire army. And it's interesting to note that within 100 years of the story of Devorah, if we put it about 1100 BCE, you can look it up, around 1200 or so, the Hittites, who are this mighty empire who fought Egypt to a standstill, who ruled over much of the Asia Minor and Mesopotamia, they disappeared just like that. And it makes sense that if their entire army, their entire armed forces were poured out against the Jews, and Devorah defeated them. So they had no army left. So obviously all the various barbarians and nomads were able to conquer them relatively quickly. So the mystery of the disappearance of the Hittite Empire is conceivably solved by the defeat, because no two-bit Canaanite city-state king could bring 900 chariots. 900 chariots means a supporting army of at least 50, 60,000, which was used for those days. So, you're talking about a huge army, maybe more. And so the general premise is that this was a major empire who Devorah has to fight. So at any rate, so Yavin, the king of Canaan, who rules in Chatzor, is probably a vassal of the Hittite Empire. The Yitzaku b'nei Yisros Hashem and as we'll see from Devorah's song, the Canaanites under the king of Chatzor and Sisera really tortured the Jews. Now, you should know that the primary focus of the king of Chatzor, the primary oppression, was on the northern tribes, Naphtali and Zavulun and Yisachar and so on. But the tribes in Transjordan, Ruvain and Gad and so on, were less harassed by Sisera. And we'll see this later. And much of what happens is not in this first part, chapter 4, which is about the war, but rather it's in the Song of Devorah. She tells us many things. And the Song of Devorah is a very ancient form of Hebrew that indeed goes back to that time. Okay. V'yitzaku b'nei Yisrael Hashem, and the children of Israel crowd out unto the Lord. When all their idols didn't work, they fell back on their last-ditch thing, and they cried to Hashem. Ki tesham meos rechav barzel lo. He had 900 iron chariots. V'ulochatz es b'nei Yisrael b'chazka esrim shana. And for 20 years, around the time, somewhere between 1200 1100 BCE, he tortured the Jewish people for 20 years. And after 20 years of oppression and suffering, they called out to Hashem, and Hashem sent them someone. And this was Devorah. And this is where the Haftarah begins. Again, we're going to spend probably more than 1 week on the Haftarah, because this is very dense and very beautiful and very important. Many of the things that are written here. Now, you should know that this particular oppression, because it lasted for 20 years, was worse than many of the other ones. And generally speaking, when the Jewish people are at wit's end, God always sends a woman. Let me explain. When there was the issue of who should inherit Abraham, and Yitzchak's position was threatened, and indeed Yishmael sought to kill Yitzchak, who shows up? Sarah. Sarah tells Abraham, this cannot be, you must send him away. So as painful as it was, it saved the Jewish people. Subsequently, when Pharaoh said, throw all the boys into the river, Amram separated from his wife. Amram was of the tribe of Levi. He was the notional head of the Jewish community then in Egypt. So all the other men of Israel separated from their wife. He said, why should I have children for them to be drowned in the river? So Miriam, who was then 6 years old, turns to her father and says, you're worse than Pharaoh, because Pharaoh is only killing the boys, but by refusing to have children, you are going to kill the girls too, the girls who won't be born. And as the result of that, as we read at the beginning of Shemot, Amram remarries his wife Yocheved, and they have Moshe, who saves the Jewish people. Furthermore, as we know, Miriam was involved in saving and hiding the Jewish children, and in encouraging the Jewish women to make sure that they had children, and as discussed at length in the Midrash. So really, Miriam is the one, even before Moses saves the Jews, Moses liberated the Jewish people. But Miriam is the one who, without her advice and her work, there would have been no Jewish people to save. So the next time is Devorah, where the Jewish people were in the process of being ground down and separated from each other to the extent that the Jewish community in Israel would ultimately have disappeared. So when things were really bad, Hashem sends Devorah. Subsequently, we had a run of very bad kings who attempted to destroy all the Torah scrolls that they could. And when Yoash, Yoshiel, discovered the scroll of Devarim, of the full scroll of the Torah that included Devarim, he went to the house of study and he asked Huldah the prophetess to authenticate the Torah. And Huldah the prophetess was able to authenticate this as one of the Torahs that Moses had written. And this is discussed very briefly in the book of Kings, thereby preserving the unbroken chain of tradition of the written Torah. And without Huldah, that might have been called into question or even disappeared. And Huldah was the one who in secret kept the study of Torah alive when the evil kings Menashe and Ammon refused to allow the Jewish people to study the Torah. So when the Torah was about to be lost, Hashem sent Huldah the prophetess. Finally, when we come to Purim, which is the only time in Jewish history that the whole Jewish people was faced with utter annihilation, because all the Jews in the world lived in the Persian Empire at that time, and the decree went out to annihilate them. Even in the terrible things that happened this century, there were always a few million Jews somewhere not in danger. But at the time of Purim, the whole Jewish people was standing by being destroyed. And Hashem sent Esther, who was a prophetess, because she wrote the book of Esther with divine inspiration. And Esther saved the Jewish people. So any time that the Jewish people are truly threatened with spiritual or physical extinction, it is the Hashem sends us, as Devorah says later in the song, a mother in Israel. Okay, so and now we begin the Haftarah. Udevorah Isha Neviah. Devorah was a woman, a prophetess.
So,
yes.
What can you tell us about the role of the woman? All these women you were talking about, they come. So, how are they interpreted? Because on one side we see other texts saying that a man should not talk to women, not so much, only what is enough.
That is absolutely true. A man should not talk to a woman or a woman to a man more than necessary. Devorah talked exactly as much as she needed to, which was a lot, but she said exactly what she needed to. In other words, there are two completely separate things over here. In the Talmud and in Jewish law, there's a very strong concept of modesty, a very strong concept that men and women should avoid inappropriate connections. And flirting and silly talk and so on is what causes inappropriate connections. That's one thing. The second thing is that every single Jew is fundamentally necessary to the mission of the Jewish people, men and women. And we know that a child follows the mother. In other words, the person who defines someone as Jewish is the mother. And the halacha has always been this way. And the concept is why? Because the essence of the Jewish soul is passed through the mother. And more than that, the reason women are exempt from many time-dependent mitzvot is because raising the next generation, creating a Jewish home, not just for one's children, but also one's husband and any guests who come. But most importantly, educating and raising the next generation is the most important thing. So on the whole, generally speaking, we say in the prophets, we say in Tehillim, Kol kavuda bat melech prima, all the glory of the king's daughter is within. In other words, what takes place, they're not talking here about jobs, okay? You can be a telephone lineman or a lawyer or a doctor, it's no difference. But spiritually speaking, the woman's focus is on passing on the essence of Judaism to the next generation, on creating, since most of Jewish life revolves around the home and not the synagogue. We could survive without Jewish synagogues. If there were no shuls, we would still survive. If no Jewish homes, we would not survive. So the Jewish home is primary and the Jewish woman is primary. However, as Devorah says later, when the Jewish people's very existence is threatened spiritually or physically, so this is no longer a problem of application, it's a problem of the essence. In other words, the essence of Judaism is threatened, since the purpose of the woman is to carry the essence of Judaism forward. So when the essence of Judaism is separated, a man cannot do it, we need a woman. Hence, all the cases in history when the essence of Judaism was threatened, we had to call upon a woman, because men deal with the external expression and women deal with the essence. That is the Kabbalistic explanation to this particular phenomenon. And I remind you, when you start talking about not talking too much to women, well, women shouldn't talk too much to men. Just as women have to be modest, men have to be modest. But the general premise is that the holiness and purity of the relationship and the avoidance of any inappropriate relationships is a very central idea in Judaism, which is irrelevant to the question of what to do when there is a great emergency. And again, when the essence of Judaism is threatened, Hashem has to send a prophet who represents the essence of Judaism, and the woman represents the essence of Judaism. Okay, because that's the quality of Malchut, the divine attribute of Malchut, which is the 10th of the 10 Sfirot, which seemingly the lowest, is also rooted in the highest, because the most profound expression of God's being is that God is revealed, is able to be present in this world. Okay. Now, so Devorah Isha Navi, at this time, Devorah was a prophetess. Now, this is not a surprise thing, because even though things like the Sanhedrin and rabbinic leadership are things that men do, a prophet is someone who God speaks to, someone who God communicates with. And that's not gender specific. Anyone who, as Maimonides tells us, is sufficiently holy and sufficiently separated from ordinary everyday concerns is capable of being a prophet. So Devorah was a prophetess, which means to say God spoke to her, God communicated with her. And this didn't necessarily mean she was going to take the role she took. Visha Eishes Lapidos. She was the wife of Lapidos. Lapidos means flames. I'll come back to this in a moment. Vishofta et Yisrael. And she judged Israel be'etahi at that time. So even though a woman doesn't sit on the Sanhedrin, if two people have a dispute and they want to solve it, they can go to anyone they want. And Devorah was the wisest and most knowledgeable in Torah person at the time. So people chose to go to her. That's what the commentaries explain. So she judged Israel at that time. And what does it mean, the wife of Lapidot? So in the Midrash, there are two explanations. The simple one, of course, is that she was the wife of Lapidos. And Barak, who we meet later, Barak means a lightning bolt. And Lapidos means a tongue of flame. It is very plausible that Lapidos and Barak are the same person. But another explanation, she was the wife of flames, was that as you know, the Mishkan, the temporary temple, was standing then in Shiloh, and she took it upon herself to make the wicks out of cotton cloth. She made the wicks for the menorah in the Beit HaMikdash, the menorah, the 7-branch menorah that burnt every day, that was kindled every day and burnt through the night, that what the Hanukkah miracle happened with. So she was called the wife of the Lady of Flame because she took it upon herself the mitzvah of making the wicks for the menorah. And of course, there's something very symbolic here, because she's coming at the darkest point in Jewish history since the Exodus from Egypt, since the slavery in Egypt. And she's the one who lights up the night by providing the wicks for the menorah in the temple to illuminate the night, because the menorah burns through the night. So those are the two explanations. He shoftet Yisrael, she judged Israel at that time.
Rabbi, are you suggesting that she was the wife of Barak?
Yes, that is a very, many midrashim say Lapidos and Barak are the same person.
Yeah, but if you read the story,
There's absolutely no evidence one way or the other if you read the story.
look, he at one point says, "I'm only going to go because she is the one that says, 'Come and save Israel.'" He says, "The only way I'm going to go if you come with me."
Well, a lot of husbands and wives do that. V'hi yoshevet tachas Talmud Devora. And it's like when my wife sends me to buy, when wife sends me, to get stuff that's for like the school year or something. I tell her to come because she knows better than me. And v'yoshevet tachas Talmud Devora. She sat underneath the palm tree of Devorah. Why was sitting under a palm tree and not in a room? Because the Yavin, Melech Hatzor, and Sisera were oppressing the Jews and didn't allow them to judge each other, didn't allow them to have a political and religious life. So she would sit under a certain palm tree that everyone knew, Bein HaRamah uvein Beit El, between Ramah and Beit El in the hill country of Ephraim. And this is, again, in what is today Shomron, today Samaria. V'yalu eleha b'nei Yisrael la'mishpat. And the children of Israel would come up to her for judgment. Just 1 second, please. Where it went. Okay, anyways, so you can look it up later where Ramah and Beit El are, because I'm not gonna run around looking for. So this is in the the northern half of Israel, but the southern part of the northern half. V'yalau b'nei Yisrael l'mishpat, and the children of Israel came to her secretly for just to be judged. And when she saw how bad things were, and she received the message from God that it's time to redeem the Jews because they had started calling out to God. They saw the Baals and the Asherahs and everything else didn't work. They started calling out to God. And Hashem spoke to her and tells her to do the following. And you'll see in a moment that God spoke to her. Vatishlach, and she sent Vatikra and called to Barak ben Avinoam from Kedesh Naphtali. Barak was from the tribe of Naphtali, one of the northern tribes in the Galilee. Vatomer Elav, and she told him, Halo tziva Hashem Elokei Yisrael. Did not Hashem command Hashem, the God of Israel, has commanded to me, to Devorah, that you leichu mashachta bahar Tavor, go and draw Sisera. Go and draw the men of Israel to Mount Tavor. Take 10,000 men from Naphtali and Zevulun who were right there in the north. And 10,000 men will be enough. And to the brook Kishon, which basically runs from Mount Tavor, which you can see today in the Galilee. It runs, I believe, all the way down to Haifa, right, Joe?
What was that?
Nachal Kishon runs all the way down to Haifa, right?
Nachal Kishon, yes.
Right. So it runs from the central part of the Galilee all the way down to the sea. So I will draw to the brook Kishon, which is a little brook, but we'll see what happens later, to Sisera, the general of Yavin, Vesrichbo, and his chariots, his Hamono, and his multitude. Again, this is not just Yavin, this is Sisera, the general of some great army. My guess, the Hittites. V'nesatiu biyadecha, and I will deliver him into your hands. Vayomer leha Barak. Barak, this is what Joel referenced. Barak said to him, Telchi imi, if you'll go with me to war, I will go. From lo telchi imi lo elech. If you won't go with me, I won't go. I want you there because you are the one Hashem directs. Fatoma, she said, fine, haloch elech imach, I will go with you. But Ephes, no, kilot yitafartech aladarach asher taholech. If you take this path and have me go with you, you will not have the glory and heroism. Since you want me to go with you, so the women are going to take over the whole business here. Ki biyad isha, in the hand of a woman. Yimkar Hashem es Sisra, God will sell Sisra. He'll hand Sisra over to a woman. You're not going to have a final victory in battle. Sisra will be defeated by a woman, as we shall see. Vatakam Devorah, and Devorah arose. Vatelech in Barak Kedsha, and went to Kadesh with Barak. This is in Kadesh in the south of Israel. This is Kadesh in the north, in the Galilee. Vayazek Barak at Zvulun ves Naphtali. Barak gathered Zvulun and Naphtali, Kedsha to Kadesh. Vayal Baraglov, and he went up by following him. Baraglov means following him, 10,000 men. Vatali mo Devorah, and Devorah went up with him. Now, we'll see this is important. Now, Hever the Canaanite had separated himself from the Canaanites, from the children of Chovev, the son-in-law of Moshe. Moses' father-in-law has descendants who lived among the Jewish people as nomads. They retained they were like a separate tribe. There's some discussion whether they were actually Jews or Gerei Toshav, righteous Gentiles who followed the 7 Noahide laws. But they were not oppressed by Sisera. They had no quarrel with Sisera. And he v'yet alo at Elam Batzanim Asher et Kadesh, and he pitched his tent from deep in Samaria all the way into the Galilee, into the north of Israel, to near Kadesh. We'll see why this is important later. V'yagidu l'Sisra, and they told Sisera, Ki Ola Barak ben Avinoam, that Barak had the chutzpah to come with 10,000 measly men to Mount Tavor. V'yazek Sisera, by the Mount Tavor does really stick up from the area around it. You really can see it for a very long distance. It's a good place to gather. And Sisera gathered all his men, 900 iron chariots. And this is the beginning of the Iron Age. So 900 iron chariots, again, is a huge amount of wealth and industrial effort. Even Goliath later has some iron and some copper. So the beginning of the Iron Age, so it's like someone shows up with thousands of tanks and so on. That in today's days. And he took all his men from Charoshet Hagoyim, from the gathering place of the nations, and he came south to Nachal Kishon, to the brook Kishon. Fatoma Devorah Barakum, Devorah said to Barak, who must have been a little bit overwhelmed by this huge host facing him, get up. Today is the day that God will give Sisera into your hand. Hello, Hashem Yatzal Ofnecha. God is going before you. Don't worry that you're outnumbered 100 to 1. Don't worry about it. You just go. Vayered Barak Mahar Tavor. And Barak went down from Mount Tavor, and the 10,000 men followed him, having faith in Devorah's promise. Vayoham Hashem et Sisera. And Hashem confused Sisera. God caused Sisera and all his chariots of his Kol HaMachane and all the camp to be destroyed by the sword before Barak. Barak's 10,000 men wiped out this whole army. Vayerek Sisera Malam Merkava, and we'll see later that the Kishon had a sudden flood, like you have sometimes in Israel, that the little brook Kishon, there was a sudden flood and swept away much of the army. So because the flood created mud, and that's another parallel to the crossing of the Red Sea, which this is the Haftarah for, that the Egyptian chariots got stuck in the mud. So Sisera's chariot got stuck in the mud, so he jumped off from his chariot because he couldn't go, and he ran away with his feet. Ubarak and Barak radaf achrei rechav achrei machana. He pursued the chariots and the enemy army ad Charoshes Hagoyim, until Charoshet Goyim, until this gathering place of the nations, until the main military cantonment of this great army. Vayipo komachne Sisra, and all the host of Sisra fell by the sword. Nishar dachad, not one man left. The only one left was Sisra, who escaped. This entire mighty host was wiped out to the last man. V'Sisra nos beragla v'lohel Yael eshet Chever Akeni. And Sisra ran away by foot to the tent of Yael, the wife of Chever the Kenite. Because Shalom ben Yavin melech Chatzor ben Beit Chever Akeni. There was peace between Yavin, the king of Chatzor, and the house of Chever the Kenite. Now, according to those interpretations, that the Kenites were a family of converts to Judaism, Yitro's descendants, the reason why the king of Chatzor did not bother them, why was there peace between this tribe and not the other Jewish tribes? Because the Kenites always served Hashem, and they never served idols. And because they never sinned, they were never placed under the power of the enemies, because only when the Jews sinned in the biblical times are they placed under the power of the enemies. Vateitza Yael likrat Sisra. And Yael went out to greet Sisra. Now Yael had a plan, because Yael was loyal to Hashem and knew Sisra was an enemy of the Jewish people and therefore an enemy of God. She had a plan. Vatomer elav Surah doni Surah elai. My master, come into the tent. Altira, don't be afraid. Vayoser ela ha'oala. Vatachaseu basmicha. And she took her into the tent. He took her into the tent and covered him with a rug, with a blanket, because they used to sit on blankets. So that way no one would know he's there. Vayomer elai told her, and hashkina ma'amayim, give me a little bit of water. Kitzamesi, because I'm thirsty. V'tifak es noda chalav. She opened, it says a bottle. She opened a skin of milk and she gave him to drink. V'techaseu, and she covered him over. Now, when you drink a lot of milk, because she didn't give him water, she gave him milk, he had to drink a lot of milk to slake his thirst. The milk makes you sleepy. V'yomer, and he said to her, Mod Pesach ha'oil, stand by the tent, and if someone comes and says, is there someone here? And say, no, there isn't. So this mighty general of empires that the whole world was afraid of is now begging a woman to hide him under a blanket. He's completely broken, completely crushed. He's shivering for his life. So what did she do? He fell asleep because she gave him milk. And that was the plan. And since they were nomads, they know how to use a hammer and a tent pin. Vatikach Yael eshet Chever, and Yael, the wife of Chever, took es yesad ha'oil, the tent pin, v'tosim es ha'makevet biyada, and she took the hammer in her hand, v'to'av v'balat, and she came to him quietly, she snuck up on him, v'titkat yaseid barakato, and she hammered the tent peg through his temples. In other words, through his brain from one side to the other. So the tent peg went through his brain and embedded itself in the ground. V'titznach ba'aretz, and it went all the way into the ground. It went right through his whole brain. V'nirdam, and he was sleeping because she gave him milk. V'ya'af, and he fainted. V'yamot, and he died. Because it's sort of hard to live without a brain. V'nei Barak rodef et Sisra. Barak was chasing Sisra. V'teitziel lekroto, and Yael went out to greet him. V'tomer and said to him, Lech, go, v'areka, and I will show you it's a ish, the man that you asher tamavakesh you're looking for. V'yovo ela, and he came to her. V'nei Sisra nofel mate. Sisra was dead. V'yatei barakato, and the tent peg was in his head. V'yechan elokim bayomo et Yavam melech Canaan, and God subdued Yavin, the king of Canaan, before the children of Israel. Vatelech yad b'nei Yisrael, the hands of the children of Israel was stronger and stronger until Yavin, the king of Canaan, until Echritu at Yavin melech Canaan, until they completely wiped out Yavin, the king of Canaan. Presumably, he didn't have the Hittites to back him up anymore because their army was gone and their empire was gone. So the Jewish people defeated him, and indeed the ruins of the city of Chatzor have been found recently. And much of it matches what we have read in the prophet. Again, typically speaking, when we do find archaeological evidence for it tends to back up what we read in the Tanakh. So this is chapter 4. This is the first half of the Haftarah. The Sfardim begin with the next part. In the Song of Devorah, there are many deep ideas, and there are many details of this story that are not found here in the introduction, which is why this might take us a while. But this is a very important section of the Tanakh. And basically, what we see is that just as the Jewish people Hashem took the children of Israel out of Egypt, and God caused their enemies to be swept under the Red Sea, to be swept with the splitting of the sea. So too, once the Jewish people returned to God, God took down another enemy. And again, it would seem another very great empire, it would seem from this story, and swept them away, this time not in the waters of the sea, but with a tiny little brook, because if you see it, you know it's a small brook, right, Joe? And it flooded tremendously and drowned the army, and those were left were wiped out by Barak. And as Devorah predicted, the glory of the defeat of Sisera came to Yael, who again, the Canaanites appear many times. Yirmiyahu talks about the Canaanites a great deal in the book of Yirmiyahu, and they seem to have been a group of people who adopted Judaism but lived their own life as nomads and didn't get caught up in a lot of their discussions. There is an interesting reading of a Talmudic passage which indicates that the children of the Canaanites may have ended up after the destruction of the first temple in Western China. It's a very interesting possibility. There seems to be a connection between the Canaanites and China, but that's another discussion when we study.
Rabbi, I would like just to mention there are two Chatzors. There's one in the Galilee, which was very heavily archaeologically studied, and it's a great place to, when you're in Israel, to go and
I was there.
See it. And there is a Chatzor in the south, not too much south, more in the center. That is one of the biggest Israeli Air Force bases. I had the privilege to serve there for a few months. And there is an Orthodox kibbutz not far, Kfar Yavne.
Sure. They make all those beautiful Aron Kodeshes and pews and such things.
Right.
They have a wonderful woodworking place.
Right.
Anyways, but this Chatzor is definitely the ancient Chatzor, which was a very big ancient city, as you point out.
Yeah.
And it was definitely part of the Hittite Empire. It was actually their southernmost outpost. So my identification of Yavin with the Hittite Empire is actually pretty solid. And the story makes sense because you don't hear a lot about the Hittites afterwards. Okay. And by the way, the Hittites were like Iranians. They were Indo-Europeans. They spoke an Indo-European language. They were not Semites, and they were not Hamites. They were related to the rest of the Europeans. Okay.
Rabbi, why were they so unfocused and they seemed like lost? They would worship idols and then go back and forth.
So we discussed that at the beginning of the class. In other words, it's really very simple. When the whole world worships idols and you're the only one, and there are other people around you who have gods that you can cuddle with and you can see, and
yeah, but this is something we see from outside. This I heard you were talking about it. You said that, and also I can see that. But isn't there anything else?
The answer is that the answer is quite simply, there was a tremendous temptation to worship idols in those days. And also because the idols didn't have all the rules. You didn't have to eat kosher. You didn't have to be moral in your relationships. You didn't have to, not cheat people. The idols let you do whatever you wanted. When the whole world does whatever they want, and you have to go home and do your homework, so you're not such a happy kid. Quite simply, the Jewish people are being asked to pioneer something. And to pioneer something is very hard. That's a simple point. There's a tremendous temptation to create a religion in your image, to create a God in your image and do whatever you please, and to listen to your desires and not to God. This is fundamental. The difference was that back then, the whole world did that. The only people who had laws of kashrut were the Jews. The only people with laws of sexual morality were the Jews. The only people who had laws of decency to your servants were Jews. The only people who had laws of decency to strangers were the Jewish people. So when you're the only one and you have this burden, even though there's no excuse, you can understand why when everyone else is having a good time, you want to go have a good time too.
But what would you suggest them?
The answer is
what would you recommend if it was today? What would you suggest?
Today, the desire for idol worship is no longer as strong as it used to be. The answer is to listen to Hashem and his prophets. That's all. You have free will. You can listen to God or not listen to God. You can look at the world outside, or you can look within and ask, what does God want from me? That struggle hasn't changed, and it isn't easy. But over time, the Jews finally not just weaned themselves from idol worship, ultimately they influenced the whole world to abandon idol worship.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the world shares beliefs against idol worship in favor of morality and so on. And that's the product of the Jewish people's work. But at the beginning, it was very, very hard. So I'm not making excuses for them, but you should understand that to adopt a very demanding way of life, in which you don't get to, everyone expected to see their God, to be able to.
I understand that. I understand
that's
that.
Also, it's hard. That's all it's hard.
This is very hard, but I would like also to know other factors and that influenced them, also other factors that influenced them to stop worshiping idols. The both things.
Well, it's quite simple. Over time, they saw that when they listened to God, things were good. When they disobeyed, things were bad. And finally, after the temple was destroyed and probably half the people were killed and so on, they learned their lesson. Because once they came back to Israel, there was no more idol worship. But it took a lot of hard lessons. And
so it was not simple.
It's not simple because God gives everyone free will, and God gives everyone a good inclination and an evil inclination. And it's perfectly balanced. And you have to choose the right thing. And because you have free will, you don't always choose the right thing. Over time, enough people chose the right thing that we ended up where we are.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, and Devorah alludes to some of these things in her song that we're going to learn next week. So next week, we're going to learn the song of Devorah, and Devorah talks about many of the things that happened and why they happened, and elaborates on the events of this war, as we shall see, as well as teaching us some very important lessons in general in Judaism, some very crucial ideas. And also Devorah predicts certain things that will happen in difficult times many hundreds and thousands of years later, as we shall see. So we've done half the Haftarah, and again, we're going to continue studying the Song of Devorah, which is such a central text in Judaism until we finish it. And then we'll pick up again on some other Haftarah. Okay.
Rabbi, can I ask you a question? You probably have a clue what I'm going to ask you. So the opening to the poem, and in Hebrew, it's a shir, a song, and it's
written as a song.
And it says, Vatashar Dvora Uvarak ben Avinoam. So what's with the Kol Isha?
Well, so there exists a prohibition against listening to a woman soloist singing if she's not related to you. So there are four possible answers. Number one, this is a rabbinic prohibition that had not yet been decreed. Number two, even if it's biblical, because there's some opinions it's biblical, the tashar, a shir, does not necessarily mean to sing with music. It can mean to recite poetry. To recite poetry is also shir. That's number two. The third answer is that since she was a prophetess, God told her to sing because God sometimes makes an exception to the rules for good reasons. The fourth answer is that though she composed the song and sang it, she, like Miriam, she only sang it to the women, and then the women went and then she wrote it down and gave it to the men. So those are the four possible answers.
Okay.
So when she sings, she can sing a lot. She can sing a lot.
Right, but she can. But also, this
But
is
she cannot talk a lot.
Yeah, but this is also. Well, she's not talking to a specific man. The prohibition is to talk to a specific man in a flirtatious way, and it's more on the men. By the way, the prohibition is more on the men than on the women. Beruria, this morning we studied. Beruria told the women, "Don't talk to me so much." That's fine. But here she's a prophetess. Hashem is speaking. She can speak as much as Hashem tells her to speak. But obviously, all the sages who knew the laws of Kol Isha, Joe, also knew of the story of Devorah. And generally speaking, this is a poem, not so much a song. It would be a very long song.
Well, today it's only observed by the Haredi community.
No, that's not true. That's not true. I know most of the modern Orthodox people I know who are knowledgeable will not listen to a female soloist who's unrelated to them.
Oh, I met quite a few of them in concerts and
well, so I'm telling you what the halacha is. There's a lot. Listen, there are a lot of people who say they're Orthodox, but eat in non-kosher restaurants where they go on vacation, right? So whatever. The bottom line is that anyone who keeps halakha, because this is not a Haredi halakha. This is a basic Orthodox halakha that anyone who follows the halakha keeps. That's all. Now, for example, a recorded voice, many people hold is not an issue, and so on. But we want to discuss halakha. We can do it in the morning, the Dvar halakha.
Yeah, exactly.
We're not here to discuss halakha.
It was just a side. It's okay.
But Joe, one thing I can assure you.
It doesn't apply to me.
But Joe, sure it applies to you. You're Jewish, it applies to you. But let me tell you something, Joe. I'll tell you something. The Chachamim who applied this halakha knew the song of Devorah too. Don't worry.
Yeah,
Does it have anything to do with Adam and Eve or no?
What would be the connection?
Or you just say it in a flirtatious way?
Yeah, I mean, yes, exactly. The issue is that you want to avoid any possible inappropriate actions or thoughts. That's the halacha. So if you don't speak inappropriately, if you don't, if you're never alone with an unrelated woman, if you sit separately in the show, you're not going to have problems. That's all.
Okay.
Plain and simple. We'll talk about that more another time.
Okay.
So next week, we are going to begin the 5th section, the 5th chapter, which is the Song of Devorah. And it may take us more than a week because it is a very, very deep piece with a lot of very subtle ideas baked into it. And it is, I think, the longest share, except for, I don't know what's longer, Devorah's song or David's song, Joe?
I think Shira Shirim is even longer.
Right, but that's a collection of songs. Anyways, but in Nevi'im, this is probably the longest song. Anyways, we can look it up later. Okay, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Have a most wonderful evening.